Good morning. So by now you've probably heard about the new national security report, basically saying that New Zealand's more in a dangerous environment, and that the citizens need to look out and be on the lookout for extremists and polarization. I mean, to be fair, I've actually seen the Security Intelligence Service actually pull up. Like, for example, they were aware of the role of Israel and cobweb technologies, and they have actually put the spotlight on them. Um, there's also has been one foreign actor that I'm aware of that they've actually acted against, sent him text messages basically saying, well, he's actually Kiwi, but sent him text messages because he was about to try and do business with some foreign country to put some money in his bank account, because that particular character, who I think I know who they're talking about, he's really only interested in the money, and he'll take money from anybody. He's just a freaking scumbag, but unfortunately he's a useful scumbag, which kind of leads me to my issue about where, again, it's becoming very fashionable for media commentators to start talking about transnational crime and the role of organised crime in New Zealand and corruption, things that I've been writing about for 20 or 30 years. But again, if you read the court report carefully and with some actual knowledge base, as opposed to just being another academic sucking at the tit of the octopus, and that goes both left and the right, because basically in the same time it feeds back to the same chain. But let's stay on target. What they're not talking about is they're talking about foreign interference, and the inference is that's by state actors. What they're not talking about is foreign interference by non-state actors, which can include such things as the Atlas Network or basically corporations. For example, I'll give you a really good heads up one. This is one that shows you how out of touch our academics are, and the so-called experts don't know what they're talking about. And when I wrote my book State Secrets in 1999, which again, fact, go look it up, I wrote a book. At that time they were saying that organised crime didn't exist in New Zealand. New Zealand was the least corrupt country in the world, because unbeknownst to most people, was that we got the forms from Canterbury International and we sent them back unfilled, and that's how we got our perfect score. And again, an absolute statement on the media, because they didn't bother to fact check. They just went, "Oh, this makes us feel good about ourselves. Yeah, go the All Blacks!" But I said this to this book, and in 1999 it came out. It was a bestseller, and not long afterwards, the police decided to commission a survey to see, well, how much organised crime there actually was in New Zealand. And lo and behold, it vindicated what I turned around and said, which was, there was more than nearly 300 different foreign outfits operating within New Zealand. Many of these were linked into gangs from overseas, and also things like the Russian mafia. Bear in mind, of course, I also talked about the Russian mafia using a monetary trail, which largely was actually created by friends of the Central Intelligence Agency, and specifically the friends that I'm talking about are actually the mining industry. So if you do the roll call, which, again, it's so frustrating that you have to do this stuff, because it's so blatantly obvious. You just literally go 1973, attempted coup in Tonga, carried out by the Phoenix Foundation, basically a consortium of far-right dickheads who wanted to set up crypto banking and do all sorts of dodgy mining in the Pacific. 1979 or 1980, same group carried out actions in Vanuatu. 1987, you've got the coup in Fiji, which Emperor Mining, which was a Canadian guy connected to Adnan Khashoggi, who was again linked to the Phoenix Foundation, provided the machine guns for it. 1995 Sandline Affair, where again the planes that were used to deliver the mercenaries from Tim Sandline, who went on to basically recruit private military contractors from the Commonwealth with the support or assistance of Her Majesty's Service, utilised airplanes called, I think it was called Bulgaria Cargo. Again, I wrote about them in my book. These guys were operating out of Hamilton Airport at the same time that we were actually having Pacific Express, which again features very extensive in my book, tied in with dodgy Israelis and dodgy CI affiliates, who effectively were kind of, and also in the process of destabilising Eastern Europe, which would begin, as it did in the Ukraine, by basically utilising arms that were delivered to the Croatian, to the Havo, who had a very long, strong connection with ASIO in Australia, going back to the 1970s, when they basically were using all these Eastern European guys to do stuff in Eastern Europe. And so they were doing that with a vote in Croatia, which then became the pretext for where NATO got involved in Bosnia, and then became the mission creep, which was largely accredited to, again, because of the threat of the increasing proliferity of nuclear weapons, which, again, when we look at things like the Wachovia banking affair, which again, my books come out in 2000, they reach the bestsellers books, nobody in the newspaper wants to talk about them. A friend of mine gives them to an editor, and he goes, I don't read conspiracy books, puts it down. 2007, New Zealandese Antonov doing exactly what I've been saying. Okay, exactly. Gets caught with a load of basically North Korean arms, and it's heading to the Middle East, where it's recognised that it will probably be swapped for weapons used for North Korea's weapons of mass destruction book. And again, I can chapter cite Brock Bank was dealing with what were they dealing with? They were dealing with osmium 80, which was material used for the triggers in nuclear weapons. Their subsidiary Zato was actually also involved in nuclear technology, and they were based out of the headquarters of South Canterbury Finance Scale Foundations, which not only would get done for were liquidated and fall over because basically they'd been claiming they had more assets than they did, but its one of its co-founders would be Alan Hubbard, who would be involved in a Paradise Papers connection to ferrous gold of South America, which in turn had people, I think, George Sylvanus Robinson from the UK, plus conservative members of Australia, that was involved in Policy Exchange, which was basically a far-right think tank that was effectively, trying to kind of stir up racism against Islamic people in the UK, while again, Alan Hubbard's co-partner at the time was Humphrey Rollison, CEO of the Press, who I also talk about in my book, actually as having been on the board of directors for a company involved in not just mercenaries, but they were largely affiliated with groups that were later linked to Nugan Bank and the organised crime and money trafficking and distribution of drugs into gangs. And in this case, Hubbard was also the founder of the Christchurch Foundation, whose sister organisation was the Tel Aviv Foundation, which was, again, could be found running around in Christchurch using charity money to kind of, basically promote banking agenda of a digital currency, while all sorts of other dodgy things were going on, but that's another story altogether. But his was Neil Jacobson, who again is known money launderer, laundering money through Canada, which again, a lot of these connections that we talked about in the... What happened was they had they found that the gangs were using these private phones, and they had a backdoor, and then for the Australian Federal, they kind of basically linked it back to Phantom Secure, and then discovered that actually Phantom Secure had Five Eyes intelligence operatives in its payroll, and they were going around kind of blowing all the whistle on the undercover agents and whatnot. But basically, the point is that this was a declaring example of something that Five Eyes failed to detect. We see from the hundreds of files just linked to Victor Alexander, they were not spotted, despite bank calls, until after Cameron Autos was outed as an agent or a mole within Five Eyes intelligence. Which also brings us to the situation was that we got no warning in advance of the Fiji coup in 1987. When the Rainbow Warrior blew up, we got no notice. When the Christchurch shooting took place, which is now having spin-offs, which I believe is starting to, there is a crackdown on corruption within the top police, and I think events in Christchurch have kind of the police have lost a little bit of their mana they had before, and where they could kind of bully Labour and National. Now they're kind of on the back foot because they know they screwed up, and they rely on other parties not to really kind of draw their attention to that. But as we see in the clubs that were being used, or the shooting clubs in Dunedin, they had connections to the same security mercenary firms that also were being used by the armed defenders. That were also, these security groups were also training were training gang members, which I know because one of them, I've heard lots of time, but only about a month ago, one of them turned around directly, who was a former road knight, and confirmed that, yes, he was being trained by this particular organisation, who was also doing training at the Christchurch shooting. So the point is, again, about this whole, and again, of course, we got the guy that was done for espionage, for the New Zealand Defence Force, but he actually wasn't actually being contacted by a foreign government in that case. It was actually police intelligence using entrapment to basically get that guy. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have exposed him, but let's actually realise that the threat really came down in Christchurch because basically a failure of intelligence detection. That the same syntax writing that was used by Auckland University academics to kind of like match up, his, Tarrant's writing in the manifesto. We can find on 4chan and 8chan channels that were warning Dunedin students not to go to university, which resulted in a lockdown after authorities, were made aware of it. So then afterwards they turned around and said, "Oh, we weren't monitoring 4chan and 8chan. We didn't know that he was doing all this stuff." That's a lie. That's an absolute lie. And so we also have public people coming to the police and saying, "By the way, there's something strange going on about this rifle club," repeatedly, including one of them, a very highly decorated soldier who, in the inquiry, is made out to be a liar because basically the police, which is why I'm saying this corruption investigation is taking place at the moment, basically pointed the finger at him and said, "Well, actually, the police were allowed to go and investigate themselves." So we would be a lot better off if, first of all, the police would turn around and start looking. Actually, first of all, again, another point I'll quickly make is that I was attached when I was in the Army Reserves. I was artillery intelligence, and I was attached to a period for counterintelligence. And my actual CO, commanding officer, was Wendy Heath, who, along with Peter O'Brien, another one of my sources in my book, State Secrets, would basically go on to appear in an article by North and South basically about the problems they had within the internal police. And as Peter Williams, another source in my book, and also mentioned in the Broken Soldiers article, turned around and said, was that we didn't go looking for corruption because we refused to believe it existed. And because we had that mindset, it thrived in that particular culture. And so again, when I was doing my attachment counterintelligence, which was a relatively new outfit, basically me and a couple of other guys who also suffered, basically got put to shires, we were quite gung-ho. We were very keen to do our jobs, and basically we had the people above us saying, "Oh no, you got to get rid of them because no, that's not. We don't want people policing us." We want, So the problem was we actually, when you talk about the espionage case in the New Zealand military. Well, they actually had a culture where they were actually opposed to counterintelligence, and that's actually been as an investigator of this issue for 30, 40 years. My biggest problem that we actually have in terms of national security is that we don't actually have a culture of counter. Say that 5 times fastwards. We don't have a culture of counterintelligence. So I would say that in many ways that most of the threats that are occurring to us would be largely probably would be detected if we did, and we would certainly be, people coming up and talking to us about people doing strange things at rifle clubs, pay more attention instead of going, no, we don't want to do it, we don't want to hear that because that's where our friends are, and we hang out with those people on the weekend and go to their barbecues. So, this whole issue, again, keeps on trying to suggest that we, the citizens, are the threat and that we should be demonised for having viewpoints. I agree, there is way too much polarisation, but there is also increasingly, that's been used as a pretext, as a reason to shut down public protest and activism. And in that environment, you can guarantee this is a historical, hardcore reality, a truism, that when you have an environment which is pro-censorship and basically does away with the rule of law or creates a two-tier system where there's one set of law for the people at the top and one set of people for the people at the bottom and no room for dissent and no room for asking questions, you can guarantee your bottom dollar that you are going to have a culture which breeds and organised crime actually thrives in it. And as I said, as of 2000, there were over 300 clubs, or 375, I think, actually, groups operating in New Zealand. I don't think I quite finished that story off, but basically saying that the money laundering that was going through Brisbane and New Zealand and Auckland at that time in 1995, basically, that's what led to one corporation owning 95% of the downtown real estate in those two areas. One corporation. Because there was no actual oversight. There was no looking at the fact that, hey, why are all these big companies buying up all, and how are they doing it? Where's that money come from? Same thing happened with the print industry. I now know that because, again, last year I was contracted by London clients that were basically investigating the guy they wanted rolled off their board, and they gave me a list of guys to go and look up, and what I actually, what I came up with was this guy's getting away with pumping all this dodgy money, which is in turn allowing him to create, in the case of New Zealand, he was doing it with printing companies, which are then shutting down local independent print because they couldn't afford to be there. So again, really destabilising effect on the country. Again, like we used to have things like, as a sideline, we used to have Pacific Island Monthly, amazing magazine. Murdoch bought it down and shut it down because it was exposing too many of his friends. And again, I've talked to you about Murdoch and the rising here, the dancing here up in Auckland. But yeah, no, we were actually having this was a major impact, but we didn't. Even when the bank's alerts were going, were sending off alarms. Nobody upstairs had any oversight because we just left it to our buddies overseas. And now, of course, we've got the FBI turning around and they're going to open up an office in Christchurch. I mean, in Wellington. I say Christchurch because I keep asking this question: if we didn't have FBI agents here in New Zealand, how come we had 2 FBI agents here within 2 hours of the shooting? That's another one of these many questions which if you ask, suddenly you get called an extremist and you get your social media shadowed bad. I call it journalism. I also call it being a good citizen. It's part of the fourth estate. But unfortunately, the same system that goes on about having to, spy on your neighbours and report to the authorities doesn't really actually seem to actually want us to have a voice where people like me can actually bring these points out and say, well, actually, maybe we need to actually have a look at some of the oversights and accountability of our own government agencies and improve upon those if we really want to stamp out the situation. And again, I've talked to you about the increasing appearance of gangs involved in New Zealand unions, which is, in the case of Australia, it's been largely taken over by the unions, who suffer from the same problem. And we've heard about the Stewart Commission and the Royal Commission, which basically, throughout Queensland, effectively, you had a state that was effectively a rogue state within the federal system where the people at the top were just doing whatever they wanted. It became so corrupt, it became normalised. And that involves, of course, things like the Nugan Bank, which then again had spin-offs to New Zealand for the Murray Loans Affair, and later on the Ron Rinwald, and even the Winebox Inquiry, which all in turn created names and organisations that we would later turn around and see in major organised crime aspects or in the Paradise Papers. All things which were reported about and acknowledged by people like myself, Michael Field, a very, very good journalist from the Pacific, who we're going to be having on my show in the near future. And again, a couple of other people which we're going to be bringing on. I'm going to be bringing a lot of very good experts and people with first knowledge of this corruption for my show, The Deadline Report. And we're going to be sort of heading it up a notch in the next couple of months, and that hopefully will be something that we'll be slowly building on. Until, of course, some authorities turn around and say, oh, no, that guy's having too much trouble. He must be a dangerous extremer. We better shut down that radio station. But in the meantime, I'll keep trucking on and being here and having a good old laugh at the experts as they come out with their brand new, staggering findings on organised crime. Because no one's ever investigated it or reported it or revealed it before.